Does anybody remember the children's book, Texas Tall Tales, or The Adventures of Pecos Bill? Good. Now, putting this talk together, I couldn't help but feel like I was about to tell one such story. But rest assured, everything I'm about to say is true, and it happened right here in San Antonio. Would you believe me if I told you that I wouldn't be here today telling this history if it was for the cost of shoe leather in France? Would you also believe that this history traces back to one of the original filmmaking pioneers? Now, would you also believe that one of the early feature films that was produced in San Antonio set the bar for how studio blockbuster films were to be made? And would you also know that there currently exists an independent movement that's making strides towards mainstream notoriety? But more on that later. Does anybody remember the name George Méliès? If the name doesn't ring a bell, you might recognize this image from his 1902 film, A Trip to the Moon. George came from a family of prominent shoemakers. The family had acquired a contract with the French military to produce all their footwear, but when the price of shoe leather went up, the family was barely able to complete their contract and were left all but financially ruined. But not to worry. George had already acquired some renown as a filmmaker, and thanks to rampant pirating in the United States, George sent his brother Gaston stateside to protect his copyrights. A condition of that copyright was that he had to produce a film a week. In order to ensure that kind of year-round production, Gaston set his sights on sunnier climates. Gaston set his sights on San Antonio. In particular, a 20-acre tract of land adjacent to the Hot Wells Hotel on the city's south side, which was a world-renowned resort of its day. Between 1910 and 1911, the Star Film Ranch produced over 80 one-reelers. Now, those films were about 15 minutes in length, and most of them were westerns. But one film that stood out above the rest was called The Immortal Alamo. Unfortunately, due to the volatile nature of film in those days, and when I say volatile, I mean chemically volatile, like they would spontaneously combust, and no one thought to make copies. A lot of those films didn't survive, but thanks to the work of film preservationists around the world, we're able to enjoy a handful of these films digitally. George unfortunately moved out of the ranch at the end of his lease and sought other exotic locations to ensure his sunny climate, and continued to do so until the company folded in 1913. But that didn't stop filmmakers from setting up shop all up and down Precious Street for one reason: to fill the screens of all the theaters that lined the streets of San Antonio. Theaters like the one we're in right now, and theaters just right outside these doors. It wasn't until the mid-20s that major Hollywood studios set their sights on San Antonio. The story of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders is one that's been told on screen several times due to its local connection, finds itself being produced here. Paramount in 1926 sought to tell a historically accurate tale of this 1898 campaign into Cuba. Everything was meticulously recreated from record and shot on location here in San Antonio, except for the scenes in Cuba. Those were shot in Camp Bullis, just right up the road, on a 100-acre tract of land dressed up to look like the island nation. Paramount was having such a great experience working with the military here in San Antonio that they doubled down and brought a second film to town that year, a more contemporary tale of American heroics, with a former World War I flyboy directing the epic of the air called Wings. The film already boasted a record-setting $2 million budget and also received military contributions up to about $16 million. You convert that to today's dollars, and you're looking at about a $285 million budget. Now think about that. Think about how many pictures in the last 5 years have gotten close or surpassed that budget. The film was so groundbreaking that it won the first Academy Award for Best Picture. It was the only silent film to ever win the award. It was the only film to be shot in San Antonio. Our city's next brush with cinematic greatness came in the 1960s for the premiere of John Wayne's epic, The Alamo. While the film was not shot on location for obvious reasons, the Duke thought it was only right to bring the premiere to where the events took place. Now, this premiere brought its own set of technological challenges due to the large format nature of the film. It would require a major investment from whatever theater was going to host this premiere. Thankfully, the Woodlawn Theater stepped up to the plate and committed $50,000 into a retrofit for a screen and a projector that could screen a 70mm film. Now, we know we like to do things big in Texas here, so this premiere was no exception. A simple red carpet premiere turned into a week-long celebration full of pomp and circumstance and celebrations at the end of October in 1960, an event that we still talk about to this day. The 70s brought a change in attitude. Gritty realism drove audiences into theaters, and Sam Peckinpah was one of the rawest filmmakers of this new era. Paired with the king of cool and America's sweetheart, you had the recipe for something magical. I always feel a sense of pride when I watch The Getaway. Seeing Steve McQueen ride a river barge on our very own Riverwalk, or watching him and Ally McGraw plot their escape in what we now call Sunset Station. And my favorite little local trivia, Steve McQueen reading a copy of the San Antonio Light. Now, being a child of the 80s, I watched a lot of local TV. I'm sure most of you have, especially the weekend matinees. One of my favorite films that I watched over and over and over again at that time was called Cloak-and-Dagger. It took me a few viewings to realize that this story took place in San Antonio, but as you can see, a lot of local landmarks were prominently featured. Chase scenes on the Riverwalk, the Tower Life building, an old-school Via bus were a lot of the visual treats that this movie offers. But the real cherry on top is the film's young star. Henry Thomas, he was a local San Antonio boy, but you might recognize him from some of his earlier work. Johnny Be Good was one of my favorite movies growing up because of its exciting football sequences. And the co-star was kind of funny. Some of those football sequences and some of the school sequences were shot in some local high schools. Now, I'd be doing this talk a major disservice if I didn't mention the Alamo's mythic reappearance on screen again in Tim Burton's film, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, even if it was just to say that there was no basement in the Alamo. San Antonio would finish out the century, putting its diverse landscapes on display in major studio productions, like standing in for an African village in Ace Ventura 2, or being put center stage in the telling of the life story of a young Tejano singer whose life was cut too short. Of course, I'm talking about the Selena movie, and that's the theater next door, by the way. Or telling the story of an FBI investigation with the backdrop of a beauty pageant, like it did for Miss Congeniality. San Antonio's star shone brightly for the world to see. Now, in the new millenniums, big major studio productions have dropped off. But that's not to say film production has stopped altogether. In the last decade or so, there's been an uptick in independent film production. And I attribute this to two reasons. First is technology. It's advanced so much that film equipment is more accessible for these modern-day storytellers. And two, the evolution of distribution, in particular the rise of streaming services, have put more San Antonio filmmakers in screens around the world. The highlight of this revolution occurred in 2012 for the production of a film called Mission Park. A local investor and local filmmaker made a commitment, a multi-million-dollar commitment, to completely produce a film in San Antonio. The film went on to enjoy a theatrical run in major markets across the city, or across the country, and acquired a distribution deal through Lionsgate. Now think about this with me for a second. If one investor was willing to put their money on Mission Park, imagine if we came together as a community and supported these modern-day storytellers. Imagine how much brighter San Antonio's star will shine in the eyes of the world. Imagine the stories we'd be able to tell a global audience. Imagine the story we'd be telling 100 years from now. Imagine all the Oscars we can win in that time. Thank you.